The sky above Saipan turned from black to deep purple as the first hints of dawn approached on July 7, 1944. In the pre-dawn darkness, thousands of Japanese soldiers, sailors, and civilians gathered in the ravines and caves north of Tanapag Harbour. Many clutched sake bottles, their final rations of alcohol distributed hours earlier. Others gripped bamboo spears, broken rifles, or nothing at all. They had been told that this final charge, this ultimate expression of Yamato Damashi, the indomitable Japanese spirit, would break the American lines, recapture the island's airfields, and turn the tide of the entire Pacific War. By sunrise, over 4,300 of them would be dead, and the myth that willpower could overcome industrial might would die with them. For 3 weeks, the Japanese garrison on Saipan had watched their defensive positions collapse under a weight of firepower they had been assured could never reach these shores. The Americans were supposed to be soft, undisciplined, more interested in Hollywood films and jazz music than in making the sacrifices necessary for victory. Tokyo Rose had told them so. General Tojo had told them so. Every propaganda broadcast from the homeland reinforced this certainty. And yet here they were, pushed into the island's northern tip, their supply lines severed, their ammunition nearly exhausted, facing an enemy that seemed to possess infinite resources and an incomprehensible capacity for coordinated violence. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The decision to launch what would become known as the largest Banzai charge of the Pacific War was born from a combination of military desperation and ideological certainty that would have seemed incomprehensible to the American Marines. And Army soldiers dug in along the defensive perimeter. To understand why thousands of propped Japanese soldiers convinced themselves that a suicidal charge with minimal ammunition and improvised weapons could succeed where weeks of prepared defensive warfare had failed, you have to understand the psychological framework that governed Japanese military thinking in the summer of 1944. The concept of seishin, or spiritual power, dominated imperial Japanese military doctrine. This wasn't simply morale or fighting spirit in the Western sense. It was a quasi-religious belief that the Japanese possessed an inherent spiritual superiority that could compensate for material deficiencies. Japanese soldiers were taught from their first days of training that one Japanese warrior equaled 10 American soldiers because the Japanese possessed purity of purpose and willingness to sacrifice, while Americans were corrupted by individualism and material comfort. This wasn't metaphor or motivational rhetoric. It was presented as empirical fact, proven by Japan's string of victories, from Manchuria through the opening campaigns of the Pacific War. Lieutenant General Yoshitsugu Saito, commander of the Saipan garrison, and Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, who had led the Pearl Harbor strike force and now found himself trapped on this doomed island, both understood the tactical hopelessness of their situation. American forces under Marine Generals Holland Smith and Army General Ralph Smith had landed nearly 70,000 troops on the island beginning June 15th. The Japanese defenders, numbering approximately 31,000, had fought with ferocious determination, but were systematically pushed northward by an enemy that could call upon naval gunfire, aerial bombardment, and artillery support that seemed unlimited in scale. By early July, the Japanese defensive perimeter had collapsed to a pocket barely 4 miles wide in the island's mountainous north. Ammunition was nearly gone, food supplies had been exhausted, medical care had become a grim joke, the wounded lay in caves with no morphine, no bandages, nothing but the certainty of slow death. Officers consumed their final rations of canned goods, while enlisted men boiled tree bark. The radio transmitter that had maintained contact with Tokyo had been destroyed. They were, in every practical sense, already defeated. But defeat in the Western military sense, surrender, prisoner exchanges, eventual repatriation, was not a category that existed in the Imperial Japanese military framework. The Senjin-kun, the military code issued by Emperor Hirohito in 1941, explicitly stated that Japanese soldiers must never suffer the shame of being captured alive. Death in battle was not simply preferable to surrender, it was the only acceptable outcome. To be captured was to dishonor not only yourself but your family, your village, your ancestors, and ultimately the emperor himself. This created a psychological trap that Western military planners consistently failed to understand. American intelligence officers studying Japanese tactics noted their suicidal tendencies, but interpreted them as fanaticism or irrationality. They missed the deeper logic. If death was inevitable and surrender was worse than death, then the manner of dying became the only variable under a soldier's control. A Banzai charge that had zero chance of military success could still be personally rational if it offered death in combat rather than slow starvation in a cave or the unthinkable shame of raising your hands in surrender. General Saito composed his final orders on the evening of July 6th. He was dying from wounds sustained in earlier fighting, and he knew these would be his last official acts. The orders he issued weren't delusional, they acknowledged that success was unlikely, but they were framed in the language of spiritual warfare that every Japanese soldier understood. The attack would commence at dawn. Every able-bodied man would participate. They would break through the American lines through sheer force of will and devotion. And if they failed when they failed, they would at least die as warriors, rather than as defeated remnants hiding in caves. What's crucial to understand is that many of the men preparing for this charge genuinely believed it might work. Not because they misunderstood the military situation, most were clear-eyed about their disadvantages in firepower and supply. They believed because they had been conditioned to believe that spiritual power could overcome material reality. Every lesson of their military training, every cultural message they had absorbed since childhood, reinforced the idea that a force animated by pure devotion to the emperor could achieve the impossible. The training that Japanese soldiers underwent was designed specifically to inculcate this worldview. Unlike American boot camp, which focused heavily on technical skills, weapons proficiency, and small unit tactics, Japanese basic training emphasized endurance, obedience, and cultivation of fighting spirit. Recruits were routinely beaten by their superiors not as punishment for specific infractions, but as a systematic program to break individualistic thinking and forge absolute obedience. They were required to perform physically impossible tasks and punished when they failed, the lesson being that failure resulted from insufficient spiritual commitment rather than physical limitation. They were taught that Japan's victories in the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 and 1905 had come despite Russia's material superiority because Japanese soldiers possessed superior spirit. The truth that Japan had been better organized, better led, and enjoyed crucial advantages in logistics and intelligence was inconvenient to the narrative. What mattered was the myth that Japanese bayonet charges had broken Russian lines through pure fighting spirit, and that this formula could be replicated indefinitely. The early successes of the Pacific War seemed to confirm this worldview. Japanese forces had conquered Malaya, Singapore, the Philippines, and the Dutch East Indies with stunning speed, often defeating numerically superior forces. But these victories owed less to spiritual power than to superior training, better jungle warfare tactics, air superiority, and the unpreparedness of colonial forces that had assumed white supremacy would intimidate Asian opponents. Japanese planners understood this. Staff officers knew exactly how crucial air cover and naval support had been, but the propaganda fed to ordinary soldiers emphasized spiritual factors. By mid-1944, the reality gap between propaganda and battlefield conditions had become a chasm. The soldiers preparing for the Saipan Banzai charge had witnessed American firepower that had no precedent in their experience. They had watched battleship shells the size of telephone poles demolish concrete bunkers. They had seen carrier-based aircraft appear in formations so large they darkened the sky. They had experienced artillery bombardments that continued for hours without pause, the shells arriving with such regularity you could set your watch by them. And yet the ideological framework remained intact. When material reality contradicts deeply held beliefs, the human mind doesn't immediately abandon those beliefs, it searches for explanations that preserve them. The Americans had more guns, yes, but guns without spirit behind them were just metal. The Americans could drop bombs endlessly, but they lacked the willingness to accept casualties in close combat. One final push, one overwhelming demonstration of Japanese fighting spirit, and the American lines would break. The enemy soldiers would panic, retreat to their ships, and the island would be saved. This wasn't entirely invented from nothing. Japanese intelligence had noted that American forces tended to withdraw when faced with determined Banzai charges rather than hold position and accept close-quarters casualties. What they failed to grasp was that these withdrawals were tactical American commanders would pull back, call in artillery and air support, and annihilate the charging forces from a distance rather than engage in the knife-fight combat where Japanese night-fighting skills and willingness to die gave them advantages. The charges didn't break American morale. They just ensured that American forces killed Japanese soldiers at minimal cost. The men gathering in the darkness on July 7th included the full spectrum of the Japanese military. There were elite naval infantry, rigorously trained and disciplined. There were army infantry who had fought in China and knew what sustained combat looked like. There were construction troops who had built the island's airfields, men trained as engineers and labourers, not warriors. There were walking wounded, men with bandaged heads and splintered arms who could barely walk but refused to remain, in the caves. There were Korean labourers who had been conscripted to work on Saipan's fortifications and now found themselves handed bamboo spears and told to charge American machine guns. Admiral Nagumo, who had commanded the carrier strike force at Pearl Harbor and Midway, would not join the charge. He committed suicide by gunshot in his cave headquarters as the attack began. His final act, a recognition that his role in Japan's early victories made his capture by Americans an unacceptable propaganda victory for the enemy. General Saito had already performed ritual suicide the previous evening, his abdomen opened by his own blade, his aide delivering the final merciful cut to his neck. The traditional samurai death, seppuku, performed correctly in the old style even as modern industrial warfare raged around them. The organization of the charge was, by necessity, improvised. Normal military hierarchy had broken down. Officers led whatever groups they could assemble. The plan, such as, called for the attack to focus on a sector held by the Army's 27th Infantry Division near Tanapag. Intelligence, such as it was at this point, suggested this might be a weak point in the American line. In reality, it was held by 2 battalions of the 105th Infantry Regiment, soldiers who had been fighting on Saipan for 3 weeks and were well prepared, well supplied, and supported by artillery. As the darkness began to lift, the Japanese forces moved into position. Sake dulled some men's fear. Others achieved a kind of transcendent calm, the acceptance of death bringing its own peace. They had written their final letters home days ago, before the paper ran out. They had burned incense if they had any, said prayers to ancestors, touched photographs of families they would never see again. Some had tied hachimaki headbands around their foreheads, white cloth with red rising suns and patriotic slogans. Others had discarded everything unnecessary, stripping to minimal clothing to move faster in the charge. The weapons they carried revealed the desperation of their situation. Some soldiers had rifles with 5 rounds of ammunition. Others had rifles with no ammunition at all, planning to use them as clubs. There were swords, both officers' katanas and improvised blades fashioned from scrap metal. There were bamboo spears, sharpened to points and fire-hardened. There were grenades, precious because explosives were nearly exhausted. Many men carried 1 grenade not to throw at the enemy, but to hold against their own chest if capture seemed imminent. Some carried nothing but rocks, planning to throw them, and then close to hand-to-hand combat where American firepower advantages would mean nothing. Officers gave final speeches. The words varied, but the themes were constant. Glory, honor, the emperor, the homeland, the ancestors watching from the spirit world, the certainty that this sacrifice would be remembered for 10,000 years. Some speeches were eloquent, drawing on classical Japanese poetry and warrior traditions. Others were simple and direct. We attack at dawn. We fight to the death. Long live the emperor. Men who had received Buddhist training chanted sutras. Others simply breathed deeply, and waited for the order. The American forces facing them had no idea what was coming. Intelligence had suggested the Japanese were finished, capable of only scattered resistance. The 27th Division had posted normal security but wasn't expecting a major assault. Many soldiers were sleeping. Others were eating breakfast rations, writing letters home, cleaning weapons, or engaged in the mundane activities of military life behind established lines. Artillery batteries were positioned to provide support if needed, but crews weren't at full alert. The assumption was that the hard fighting was over, that the remaining Japanese would either surrender or be systematically reduced in the coming days. This assumption was about to be catastrophically tested. At approximately 04:30 hours, as the sky shifted from purple to grey, the Japanese attack began. It didn't start with a coordinated assault wave. It started with screaming thousands of voices raised in battle cries, the traditional Tenno Heika Banzai, "Long live the Emperor," echoing across the hills. Then came the sound of running feet, thousands of men moving together, and the scattered rifle shots from those who still had ammunition. The American sentries and forward positions reacted with shocked confusion that rapidly became controlled violence. Flares shot into the sky, illuminating a scene that seemed pulled from medieval warfare, masses of men running forward with swords and spears, screaming, some firing rifles, others waving flags. A human wave pouring down the hillsides toward the American lines. Machine guns opened fire immediately. The Browning M1917 water-cooled heavy machine guns that formed the backbone of American defensive positions could fire 400 to 600 rounds per minute with trained crews. Each gun could sustain fire almost indefinitely, as long as ammunition and cooling water held out. And the Americans had both in abundance. The initial Japanese wave hit the forward American positions with suicidal fury. In some sectors, they broke through, overwhelming isolated positions through sheer numbers and willingness to die. Hand-to-hand fighting erupted in foxholes and trenches. Japanese soldiers armed with swords killed Americans in their sleeping bags. Officers with katanas dueled with Americans wielding entrenching tools and bayonets. For perhaps 15 minutes, the outcome seemed genuinely in doubt. Could mass devotion and acceptance of death overcome firepower and supply? Then the American artillery began to answer. Forward observers called in coordinates. Within minutes, the pre-registered artillery concentrations that had been plotted for exactly this contingency began to fall. The 105th Infantry was supported by multiple artillery battalions equipped with 75mm pack howitzers and 105mm howitzers. These weren't the massive naval guns or heavy artillery. This was the mobile, responsive fire support that American forces could call upon almost instantly and sustain indefinitely. The shells began falling into the masses of Japanese soldiers, still forming up for follow-on waves. High explosive rounds detonated with killing radiuses of 30 yards or more. Men who had survived 3 weeks of bombardment, who had learned to take cover at the whistle of incoming shells, had nowhere to hide in the open ground of the charge. They were committed to moving forward or dying where they stood, and the American artillery killed them in groups, dozens at a time, hundreds in the space of minutes. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The battle devolved into a slaughter that continued through the morning. Japanese soldiers kept coming in waves, smaller groups now, disorganized, some led by officers who refused to accept the obvious futility, others simply running forward because turning back meant dying alone in the caves. The Americans killed them systematically, professionally, without hatred but without mercy. This wasn't combat in the traditional sense. It was industrial killing. American firepower applied to human targets with the same methodical efficiency that characterized American manufacturing. By 0800 hours, the main force of the charge had been destroyed. Bodies lay in windrows where machine gun fire had caught them. The ground in front of American positions was carpeted with dead, some areas so densely packed with corpses that later burial details would describe having to walk on bodies because there was no clear ground. The final count would eventually reach 4,300 Japanese dead in this single action, though the exact number would never be known with certainty because some bodies were never recovered and others were too fragmentary to count. What happened in those 4 hours on Saipan wasn't a battle in any meaningful military sense. It was a demonstration of what happens when ideological certainty collides with industrial reality. The Japanese soldiers who charged believed, many of them genuinely and completely, that their spiritual power and willingness to die would overcome American material advantages. They had been taught this their entire military careers. Their culture supported it, their officers reinforced it, and when put to the test against an enemy with effectively unlimited ammunition, artillery support, and the organizational capacity to apply overwhelming firepower continuously for hours, that belief was revealed as catastrophically false. The Americans didn't break. They didn't panic. They didn't run. They stood their ground and killed attackers with a mechanical efficiency that had no precedent in the Japanese experience. Individual American soldiers showed tremendous courage, men who held positions against overwhelming numbers, who fought hand-to-hand when positions were overrun, who refused to retreat even when the situation seemed hopeless. But their courage was supported by something the Japanese lacked: a logistics system that ensured they never ran out of ammunition, a medical system that could evacuate wounded under fire, an artillery system that could place shells precisely where needed within minutes, and a command structure that could coordinate all these elements even in the chaos of close combat. The Japanese soldiers who survived the initial waves and made it back to the caves faced a grim reckoning. The charge hadn't broken the American lines. It hadn't recaptured the airfields. It hadn't changed anything except to reduce Japanese combat strength by over 4,000 men in a single morning. The myth that fighting spirit could overcome material disadvantage had been tested under the most extreme conditions imaginable and had failed absolutely. In the caves and ravines, the surviving Japanese soldiers faced the reality they had been avoiding. The Americans weren't going to collapse. They weren't going to run out of supplies. They weren't soft or cowardly. They were, in fact, the most materially powerful military force ever assembled, and no amount of devotion to the emperor or cultivation of fighting spirit was going to change that fundamental reality. Some drew the logical conclusion and chose surrender, though this remained rare. The shame culture was too strong, the training too thorough. More common was individual suicide men who used their last grenade on themselves or jumped from cliffs rather than face capture. Others simply faded into the jungle interior, planning to continue guerrilla resistance, or hoping to evade the Americans until relief came from a homeland that had already written Saipan off as lost. But for a significant number of survivors, the Banzai charge's failure triggered a psychological break that would have seemed impossible weeks earlier. These men had been absolutely certain of their spiritual superiority. They had believed, with complete conviction, that one Japanese soldier equaled 10 Americans. They had accepted as empirical fact that fighting spirit could overcome material disadvantage, and they had just witnessed that belief system destroyed in the most visceral, undeniable way possible by running directly at American positions and being killed in thousands without inflicting comparable casualties or achieving any military objective whatsoever. The psychological impact of this reality check would extend far beyond the individual soldiers who experienced it. The fall of Saipan marked a turning point in the Pacific War, not just strategically, though placing American B-29 bombers within range of the Japanese home islands was enormously significant, but psychologically, it demonstrated to Japanese military leaders, to the civilian population, and eventually to the emperor himself that the war was unwinnable. Not because Japanese soldiers lacked courage or devotion, but because the material disparity was too vast to overcome through spiritual means. The morning sun rose over Saipan on July 7th, revealing a landscape transformed into an abattoir. American soldiers moving forward to secure their positions and assess damage walked through scenes that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. One Marine corporal, interviewed years later, described the ground as carpeted with bodies, like someone had laid out a rug of dead men. Another soldier reported that in some areas the bodies were stacked 3 deep, where multiple waves had been caught by the same machine gun positions. The smell of blood and opened bodies mixed with cordite and the sweet rot smell of tropical decomposition beginning in the heat. American casualties from the Banzai charge were significant but disproportionately small compared to Japanese losses. Approximately 400 American soldiers were killed or wounded in the fighting, most in the initial breakthrough when Japanese forces overran forward positions in the pre-dawn darkness. But the ratio, roughly 10 Japanese dead for every American casualty, was the inverse of what Japanese military doctrine had promised. The equation had been flipped, and the implications were devastating. Burial details began the grim work of clearing bodies. The scale exceeded anything they had prepared for. American dead were evacuated to collection points for identification and eventual burial in military cemeteries. Japanese dead posed a different problem. There were too many, in too advanced a state of decomposition in the tropical heat, and the American priority was securing the island rather than providing proper burial for enemy soldiers. Mass graves were dug by bulldozers. Bodies were pushed into shell craters and covered with coral and dirt. Some areas were simply left, the bodies decomposing where they fell because the tactical situation didn't allow time for proper burial operations. In the caves and ravines of northern Saipan, the Japanese survivors confronted the reality of their situation. Food was completely exhausted. Ammunition was gone. Medical supplies had run out days ago. The wounded lay in darkness with no morphine, no bandages, often no water. Some had gangrene setting into tropical wounds, the sweet sick smell announcing their slow death. Others had dysentery so severe they could barely move. Still, others had been wounded in earlier fighting and had survived on willpower alone. But now that willpower was exhausted along with everything else. The American response to the remaining Japanese forces evolved into what military historians would later call a reduction campaign, the systematic elimination of resistance through overwhelming firepower rather than infantry assault. Why risk American lives clearing caves when you could seal them with explosives or pump them full of flame from flamethrowers? The Marines and Army units moved methodically through the remaining Japanese-held territory, using demolitions, flamethrowers, and close air support to destroy resistance without exposing soldiers to ambush. This methodical destruction forced Japanese survivors into an impossible choice. They could remain in the caves and die slowly from starvation, disease, or American demolitions. They could attempt to break through American lines in small groups or individually, almost certainly resulting in death, but at least death in combat. Or they could do the unthinkable surrender. The first Japanese soldier to surrender to American forces on Saipan after the Banzai charge was a young private named Matsuda, though his full name was never recorded in American records. He emerged from a cave near Marpi Point on July 9th, 2 days after the charge, his hands raised, calling out in broken English, "No shoot, no shoot." Marines took him into custody, searched him for weapons, and sent him to the rear for interrogation. He was emaciated, dehydrated, and in shock not from physical wounds, but from the psychological trauma of having survived when death had been presented as the only honorable outcome. His interrogation revealed the mindset that had driven the Banzai charge and the devastating impact of its failure. He had genuinely believed that the attack would succeed. Not because he misunderstood the military situation, he knew the Americans had more guns, more supplies, more of everything, but because he had been taught that spiritual power trumped material advantage. When asked why he thought a charge with minimal ammunition could break American lines, he explained that they had been told American soldiers were cowardly individualists who would panic and flee when faced with true warriors willing to die. The interrogator, a Nisei second-generation Japanese-American translator who spoke fluent Japanese, pressed him on this point. Had he not seen evidence of American firepower? Had 3 weeks of bombardment not demonstrated that the Americans possessed overwhelming material superiority? Matsuda's response was telling. Yes, he had seen the firepower, but he had been taught that firepower without fighting spirit was meaningless. The Americans could drop all the bombs they wanted, but when it came to face-to-face combat, one Japanese soldier would beat 10 Americans, because the Japanese possessed Yamato Damashi and the Americans did not. And what did he believe now, after the charge? The translator noted in his report that Matsuda began crying at this question. He said he didn't know what to believe anymore. Everything he had been taught was wrong. The Americans hadn't run. They had stood and fought and killed thousands of Japanese soldiers without breaking. The spiritual power he had cultivated through years of training and indoctrination had meant nothing against machine guns and artillery. He had charged forward fully prepared to die, certain that his death would contribute to victory, and instead he had survived to witness complete defeat and face the shame of capture. His testimony provided a window into the psychological state of the surviving Japanese forces. They weren't simply defeated militarily, they were experiencing a complete collapse of their worldview. The ideological framework that had sustained them through years of war, that had made sense of sacrifice and hardship, had been revealed as fundamentally false. And this revelation was more devastating than the physical defeat because it meant their sacrifices had been for nothing. More Japanese soldiers began surrendering in the days following the Banzai charge, though the numbers remained relatively small. The shame culture was too deeply embedded, the fear of how surrendering soldiers would be treated by their captors too great, and the belief that capture meant torture and death too persistent. American efforts to encourage surrender, dropping leaflets, broadcasting messages in Japanese promising good treatment, displaying captured Japanese soldiers who were being well treated, had limited effect because the soldiers had been taught that these were tricks to lure them to dishonor and death. But the trickle of surrenders did continue, and each prisoner provided similar testimony about the psychological impact of the Banzai charge's failure. They had believed the propaganda completely. They had accepted as fact that Japanese spiritual superiority would overcome American material advantages. The charge had been their absolute test of this belief, and it had failed catastrophically. Now they were adrift, uncertain of everything they had been taught, facing the reality that their sacrifices had achieved nothing and their comrades had died for a delusion. The civilian population of Saipan faced an even more tragic reckoning with this reality. Thousands of Japanese civilians had been living on Saipan settlers, families of military personnel, workers brought in to support the garrison and develop the island's infrastructure. They had been told the same propaganda as the soldiers, that Americans were savage, would torture and murder prisoners, would rape women, and would treat captured Japanese with inhuman cruelty. Better death than capture was the message drilled into them. In the days following the Banzai charge, as American forces secured the last Japanese positions, hundreds of Japanese civilians committed suicide rather than face capture. The most horrific scenes occurred at Marpi Point and Suicide Cliff, where families jumped from high cliffs onto rocks below. American soldiers watched in horror as mothers threw their children off cliffs before jumping themselves. Fathers killed their families with grenades before detonating one against their own chest. Old people who couldn't walk to the cliffs cut their own throats or were killed by younger family members to spare them from capture. American forces tried desperately to prevent these suicides. Loudspeakers broadcast messages in Japanese promising safety and good treatment. Nisei translators called out to civilians, explaining that no harm would come to them. Some American soldiers physically restrained Japanese civilians trying to kill themselves, though the cultural and language barriers made this difficult and often impossible. The suicides continued for days, with the final count of civilian dead from suicide reaching over 1,000 people who killed themselves or their families rather than accept American assurances of safety. This mass suicide was the logical endpoint of the propaganda that had driven the Banzai charge. If you genuinely believe the enemy will torture you to death, if you genuinely believe capture means degradation and horror worse than death, then killing yourself and your family becomes a rational choice. The tragedy was that the propaganda was completely false. American forces treated Japanese prisoners humanely, provided medical care, adequate food, and protection under the Geneva Conventions. But the civilians had no way of knowing this, and the Japanese military had spent years ensuring they would never believe American promises, even if they heard them. The few civilians who did surrender and survived provided testimony that mirrored the soldiers' experience complete shock at discovering that Americans were not the savage monsters they had been taught to fear. They received medical care for their injuries and malnutrition. They were fed not luxuriously but adequately, better than they had eaten in the final weeks under Japanese control when supplies were exhausted. They were housed in internment camps that were basic but safe. They were treated, in short, as human beings rather than the subhuman enemies. Japanese propaganda had taught them to expect treatment as. One woman, identified only as Mrs. Takahashi in American records, had lost her husband in the fighting and attempted to kill herself and her 2 children by jumping from suicide cliff. She succeeded in throwing both children to their deaths, but was physically restrained by an American Marine before she could follow them. In her initial interrogation, she screamed and fought, certain she was about to be tortured and raped. Instead, she was given water, medical attention for her injuries, and eventually processed into the civilian internment camp. Her testimony, recorded weeks later after she had recovered somewhat from her trauma, revealed the depth of the propaganda's impact. She had genuinely believed that American soldiers would rape any Japanese woman they captured, that they would torture prisoners for entertainment, that death was preferable to the horrors of American captivity. When asked why she believed this, she explained that Japanese radio broadcasts had described American atrocities in graphic detail. Officers had given speeches warning civilians what to expect if captured. The message had been constant and consistent. Death is better than capture. And now, having survived and experienced the reality of American treatment, what did she believe? Her response, recorded in the translator's notes, was heartbreaking. "I killed my children for nothing. I believed lies, and my children are dead." The psychological weight of this realization that she had murdered her own children based on propaganda that was completely false drove her to multiple suicide attempts in the internment camp. She eventually succeeded in hanging herself 6 weeks after the battle ended. The strategic implications of Saipan's fall extended far beyond the immediate tactical situation. The island's capture placed American B-29 Superfortress bombers within range of the Japanese home islands. Construction battalions immediately began extending the airfields to handle the massive bombers. Within months, B-29s would be launching raids on Japanese cities, including the firebombing campaigns that would kill hundreds of thousands of civilians and destroy much of Japan's remaining industrial capacity. The political impact in Tokyo was immediate and severe. Emperor Hirohito, who had been shielded from many battlefield defeats by advisors who downplayed losses, could not ignore Saipan's fall. The island had been considered an integral part of the homeland defense perimeter. Its loss meant American bombers could now strike Tokyo itself. Within days of Saipan's fall, Prime Minister Hideki Tojo's government collapsed. Tojo, the architect of Japan's aggressive expansion and the face of the military government, was forced to resign in disgrace. His replacement, General Kuniaki Koiso, inherited a war that was clearly unwinnable, but which Japanese military culture and political structure made it impossible to end through negotiated surrender. For the Japanese military establishment, Saipan represented a crisis of doctrine that went beyond tactical defeat. The Banzai charge had been the ultimate expression of their military philosophy, spiritual power overcoming material disadvantage through acceptance of death and absolute devotion. Its catastrophic failure couldn't be explained away as poor planning or bad luck. It had been executed exactly as doctrine prescribed, masses of devoted soldiers attacking with complete willingness to die, and it had failed utterly. The Americans had simply killed them all and continued advancing. This forced a reckoning within Japanese military planning. Some officers began advocating for more realistic tactics that acknowledged American material superiority and sought to maximize casualties through defensive warfare rather than offensive spirit attacks. Others doubled down on the spiritual warfare doctrine, arguing that the Banzai charge had failed not because the doctrine was wrong, but because it hadn't been executed with sufficient purity of spirit. This internal debate would continue through the final year of the war, with devastating consequences for both Japanese soldiers and civilians. The individual stories of Japanese soldiers who survived Saipan and were captured provide the most intimate glimpse into the psychological impact of the Banzai charge's failure. Interrogation reports from the summer of 1944 reveal a consistent pattern. Soldiers expressing complete shock that their training and beliefs had proven false, struggling to reconcile their lived experience with what they had been taught their entire military careers. One sergeant, name redacted in American records, had served since the China campaigns in the 1930s. He had participated in numerous Banzai charges against Chinese forces and had seen them succeed in breaking enemy lines and creating panic. When asked why he thought a Banzai charge would work against Americans when it had failed so catastrophically, his response revealed the fundamental misunderstanding that drove Japanese tactical doctrine. Chinese forces had been poorly trained, poorly equipped, and often composed of pressed peasants with minimal military training. American forces on Saipan were professional soldiers with extensive training, unlimited ammunition, and coordinated fire support. The sergeant had assumed that the Banzai charge was a universal tactic that worked against any enemy, when in reality its previous successes had been against specifically vulnerable opponents. His testimony continued with a remarkable admission. He now understood that Japan could not win the war. Not because Japanese soldiers lacked courage. The Banzai charge had proven beyond any doubt that Japanese soldiers would die without hesitation when ordered. But because courage without ammunition, without food, without air support, without naval support, without the industrial capacity to replace losses, meant nothing against an enemy that possessed all those things in abundance. He had watched American ships offshore firing continuously for hours, never seeming to run out of shells. He had seen American aircraft overhead in formations so large they seemed like clouds. He had experienced American artillery that could place shells precisely where needed, within minutes of being called in. And he had finally understood that no amount of fighting spirit could overcome that level of material superiority. When asked if he thought other Japanese soldiers understood this, he said no. Most still believed the propaganda, because they hadn't experienced the full weight of American firepower in a single, concentrated demonstration like the Banzai charge. They could rationalize smaller defeats, attribute them to local factors or bad luck. But the Banzai charge allowed no such rationalization. It had been the absolute test of Japanese military doctrine, and the doctrine had failed completely. The American soldiers who fought on Saipan and witnessed the Banzai charge came away with their own psychological scars and lessons. Many expressed conflicted feelings about the slaughter. There was no honor in gunning down waves of attackers, many armed only with spears or nothing at all. It wasn't combat in the traditional sense, it was execution at industrial scale. But there was also no alternative. The Japanese had chosen to attack. They had kept coming even when the futility was obvious. And American soldiers had responded by killing them as efficiently as possible to protect their own positions and lives. Some American soldiers reported feeling respect for the courage Japanese soldiers had shown even in a futile cause. One Marine lieutenant wrote in his diary, "They came at us knowing they would die, and they didn't hesitate. That takes a kind of courage I can't fully understand. But it's also insane throwing lives away for no tactical gain, no military purpose, just to avoid the shame of surrender. What a waste." This tension between respect for individual courage and contempt for the system that demanded such pointless sacrifice was common in American accounts. Others focused on the horror of the civilian suicides, which affected American soldiers deeply. These were not enemy combatants, they were families, children, elderly people who had been so thoroughly indoctrinated with fear of American forces that they chose death over capture. One Navy corpsman who had treated Japanese civilians after they were rescued from suicide attempts wrote, "They had been taught we were monsters, and they believed it so completely they would rather die than meet us. When they realized we were just trying to help them, just trying to give them food and medical care, some of them broke down crying. Others just stared, like they couldn't process what was happening. The propaganda had done something to their minds that was almost impossible to undo." The long-term impact of the Saipan Banzai charge extended into Japan's final year of the war and shaped post-war understanding of Japanese military culture. American military planners studying the battle drew conclusions that would influence invasion plans for the Japanese home islands. If Japanese forces were willing to launch suicidal attacks even when defeat was certain, if civilians were willing to kill themselves rather than surrender, then an invasion of Japan itself would result in catastrophic casualties on both sides. This analysis contributed to the decision to use atomic weapons against Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the belief that only a shock so overwhelming it exceeded even the psychological conditioning of Japanese military culture could force surrender, without an invasion that would kill millions. Whether this analysis was correct remains debated by historians. Some argue that Japan was already seeking surrender terms before the atomic bombs and that the weapons were unnecessary. Others maintain that Japanese military culture made surrender impossible without a demonstration of force so absolute that it left no room for rationalization or continued resistance. The Saipan Banzai charge was cited in both arguments as evidence of fanatical devotion that required overwhelming force to overcome, and as evidence that Japanese soldiers and civilians would accept inevitable defeat once it was made undeniably clear. For the Japanese soldiers who survived the war and eventually returned home, the memory of Saipan and the Banzai charge remained traumatic for the rest of their lives. In post-war interviews conducted by Japanese historians, survivors expressed complex feelings about the experience. Some maintained that the charge had been the honorable choice, even though it failed that dying in battle was preferable to slow death from starvation or the shame of surrender. Others expressed bitter anger at the officers who had ordered the charge and the propaganda system that had made it seem like a viable tactic. Still others struggled to articulate any coherent view, the trauma of the experience having never fully healed. One survivor, interviewed in 1987 at age 68, described the moment he realized the charge had failed and what it meant. "We were told that one Japanese soldier equaled 10 Americans. We believed it completely, and then we charged, and they just killed us. They didn't run, they didn't panic, they just stood there and killed us like we were targets at a shooting range. I survived because I fell into a shell crater when the man in front of me was shot, and I couldn't bring myself to climb out and continue. I lay there listening to men dying all around me, hearing the machine guns that never seemed to stop firing, and I understood that everything we had been taught was a lie. That was almost worse than the physical fear, knowing that we had been lied to and that we had believed the lies so completely we were willing to die for them." He continued, "After the war, I tried to make sense of it. Why did our leaders order such an attack? Did they believe the propaganda themselves, or did they know it was futile and order it anyway? I think some believed it, they had been raised in the same system, taught the same lies. But others must have known. They must have understood that spiritual power couldn't defeat machine guns and artillery. And they ordered the charge anyway because to do otherwise would be to admit defeat, and the culture couldn't accept that. So 4,000 men died to preserve the fiction that we could still win, or at least to avoid the shame of admitting we had lost. The Saipan Banzai charge has become, in historical memory, a symbol of the fundamental tragedy of the Pacific War, the collision between an ideology that valued spiritual devotion above material reality and an industrial military system that could apply overwhelming firepower with unprecedented efficiency. It demonstrated in the starkest possible terms what happens when belief systems rooted in cultural tradition and martial romanticism encounter modern industrial warfare. The result wasn't glorious death in battle or heroic sacrifice that turned the tide, it was simply slaughter, thousands of men killed in hours because they had been taught that willpower could overcome bullets. The broader lesson extended beyond military tactics. The Banzai charge revealed how propaganda and ideological conditioning can create belief systems so powerful that people will act on them even when contradictory evidence is overwhelming. The Japanese soldiers who charged on July 7th had spent 3 weeks experiencing American firepower firsthand. They knew the Americans had more guns, more ammunition, more of everything. And yet they charged anyway because the ideological framework they had been raised in told them that material factors were secondary to spiritual factors, and they believed this more strongly than they believed the evidence of their own eyes. This pattern of ideology overriding observable reality, of belief systems persisting despite contradictory evidence, of people acting on taught certainties, even when those certainties lead to obvious disaster, is not unique to Imperial Japan or to World War II. It recurs throughout human history, wherever systems of indoctrination successfully instill beliefs that are immune to empirical testing. The Saipan Banzai charge is simply one of the most dramatic and well-documented examples of what happens when such belief systems are tested against reality in the most unforgiving way possible. The physical landscape of Saipan still bears traces of the battle. The cliffs where civilians jumped remain, now sites of memorial and remembrance. The caves where Japanese forces made their last stands have been preserved in some areas, sealed in others. The beaches where American forces landed are now tourist destinations, the pillboxes and bunkers that once guarded them slowly crumbling into the jungle. And in the northern part of the island, in the areas where the Banzai charge took place, there are still occasionally discoveries of bones of soldiers who died in the charge and were never properly buried, gradually being revealed by erosion and jungle growth. For the people of Saipan itself, particularly the indigenous Chamorro population who endured Japanese occupation and were caught in the middle of the battle, the Banzai charge and its aftermath represented a different kind of tragedy. They had witnessed both the brutality of Japanese military occupation and the violence of American liberation. Many Chamorro civilians died in the fighting, caught between two foreign armies fighting over their island. The post-war period brought American administration that was preferable to Japanese occupation, but still represented foreign control of their homeland. The memorials and historical sites that preserve the battle's memory focus primarily on American and Japanese experiences, with Chamorro suffering and perspective often marginalized in the historical narrative. The final count of Japanese military dead on Saipan exceeded 29,000 out of approximately 31,000 defenders. Only around 1,000 Japanese soldiers survived to be captured, and many of these died from wounds, disease, or suicide in the days and weeks following the battle. The Banzai charge represented roughly 15% of total Japanese military deaths on Saipan, but occurred in a single night and morning, a concentration of dying that had few parallels even in the brutal Pacific War. American casualties for the entire Saipan campaign totaled approximately 3,000 killed and 10,000 wounded out of 70,000 troops committed. The ratio of approximately 10 Japanese dead for every American killed represented the fundamental imbalance that the Banzai charge had tried and failed to overcome. Japanese military doctrine had promised that Japanese soldiers would kill Americans at a 10-to-1 ratio in their favor through superior fighting spirit. Reality delivered the inverse, and no amount of willingness to die could change the mathematics of industrial warfare. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.